Ancient Tibetan masters mapped consciousness after death with the precision of neurosurgeons, creating detailed guides that modern science is only beginning to validate. While we debate whether consciousness survives the body, these masters spent centuries documenting exactly how awareness transforms, travels, and experiences reality in the afterlife realms. I've studied these consciousness maps for 14 years, and what they reveal about the nature of mind will shatter everything you think you know about death. In the next 15 minutes, you'll discover how consciousness continues in a subtle energy body that can perceive the living world, why time and space operate completely differently for departed awareness, and the specific stages where memory and identity gradually dissolve into the universal mind. But here's what stunned me most: these ancient descriptions perfectly match modern near-death research and quantum consciousness theories. The masters weren't guessing, they were reporting direct observations of consciousness freed from physical limitations. This knowledge doesn't just explain what happens after death, it reveals the true nature of awareness itself and why you are far more than your physical brain. What if I told you that the most sophisticated maps of consciousness after death weren't created by modern scientists, but by Tibetan masters over 1,000 years ago? While Western science struggles to explain consciousness even in living brains, these ancient explorers developed precise cartographies of awareness that survives bodily death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead isn't just spiritual poetry, it's a technical manual based on centuries of systematic observation. These masters didn't theorize about consciousness after death. They trained themselves to remain aware during the dying process, documenting their experiences with scientific precision. They mapped the subtle body that carries consciousness, tracked how awareness transforms through different post-death states, and identified the specific stages where individual identity dissolves into cosmic consciousness. Tonight, I'm going to reveal what these consciousness explorers discovered about the nature of mind itself. You'll learn why consciousness doesn't need a brain to exist, how awareness operates in dimensions beyond physical space and time, and what this ancient knowledge reveals about your true nature right now, while you're fully alive. But first, let me share the moment that convinced me these weren't mystical fantasies, but precise observations of consciousness reality. 5 years ago, I was studying with a Tibetan master when his elderly teacher died. Instead of the grief I expected, the master smiled and said, "He's still here. His consciousness is simply operating from a different vehicle now." What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about death and awareness. Consciousness as fundamental reality is the foundational insight of Tibetan death science. Unlike Western materialism, which sees consciousness as produced by the brain, Tibetan masters understood awareness as the fundamental fabric of reality itself. The brain doesn't create consciousness, it focuses and channels it, like a radio receiving signals that exist independently of the receiver. When the brain dies, consciousness doesn't disappear, it simply operates without its physical focusing mechanism. This is why Tibetan masters describe death not as the end of awareness, but as consciousness returning to its natural, unlimited state. The subtle body vehicle is how consciousness continues after physical death. The masters map this energy body with extraordinary precision, describing it as composed of subtle matter that can travel instantly through space, perceive without physical senses, and interact with both the living and the dead. This subtle body isn't imagination, it's the vehicle that carries your sense of identity, memory, and awareness through the post-death journey. Modern research on out-of-body experiences and near-death phenomena provides compelling evidence for exactly this kind of consciousness vehicle. Memory and identity persistence occurs because consciousness carries its accumulated patterns, what Tibetans call karmic imprints, into the afterlife. Your personality, memories, and habitual ways of thinking don't disappear at death. They continue in the subtle body, gradually transforming as consciousness moves through different post-death states. This is why the recently deceased often appear in dreams or visions with their familiar personality intact. Their consciousness is still operating with the same identity patterns, just in a different vehicle, Perception without physical senses becomes possible because consciousness has its own inherent capacity for awareness. The subtle body can see without eyes, hear without ears, and know without thinking. This perception is often described as more vivid and immediate than physical sensation because it's not filtered through dense matter. Near-death experiencers consistently report this enhanced perception, seeing their own bodies from above, observing medical procedures in detail, even perceiving events in distant locations. This matches exactly what Tibetan masters described as the natural perceptual abilities of consciousness freed from physical limitations. Communication abilities remain intact because consciousness can directly interface with other minds. The deceased can perceive the thoughts and emotions of the living, respond to prayers and intentions directed toward them, and even influence physical events through focused intention. This isn't supernatural, it's consciousness operating according to its natural laws, which are simply different from the laws governing physical matter. When awareness isn't constrained by a physical brain, it can interact directly with other consciousness and even influence material reality through quantum field effects. The gradual transformation process occurs as consciousness adapts to operating without physical limitations. Initially, the subtle body maintains familiar patterns and perceptions. But gradually, as it moves through different post-death states, consciousness begins to expand beyond individual identity toward universal awareness. This transformation isn't random, it follows predictable stages that the masters mapped with extraordinary precision. Understanding these stages reveals not just what happens after death, but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Tibetan masters identified 3 distinct stages of consciousness after death, each with specific characteristics, challenges, and opportunities. These aren't religious beliefs. They're systematic observations of how awareness transforms when freed from physical constraints. Stage 1. The clear light experience occurs immediately after death, when consciousness first separates from the physical body. In this stage, awareness encounters what the masters call the clear light of death, pure consciousness without any content, like a vast, luminous sky without clouds. This isn't a mystical vision, it's consciousness recognizing its own fundamental nature. For a brief period, usually lasting minutes to hours, awareness exists in its purest form, free from thoughts, emotions, memories, or any sense of individual identity. This is consciousness as it truly is, unlimited, luminous, and completely at peace. Most people find this experience overwhelming because they've never encountered consciousness without content. They retreat from this vast openness back into familiar mental patterns, missing the opportunity for what Tibetans call liberation in the clear light, permanent merger with universal awareness. Stage 2. The bardo of visions begins when consciousness starts generating experiences again. Unable to rest in pure awareness, the mind begins projecting visions that seem completely real but are actually manifestations of its own contents, like vivid dreams that feel more real than waking life. These visions aren't random. They're organized manifestations of the consciousness's accumulated patterns, appearing first as peaceful, beautiful experiences, then as increasingly intense and sometimes frightening encounters. The masters mapped these vision sequences with extraordinary detail, identifying specific types of experiences and their psychological meanings. What's remarkable is that consciousness in this stage has tremendous creative power. Thoughts instantly manifest as experiences, emotions become visible as colors and forms, and mental patterns appear as encounters with various beings. This reveals something profound about the nature of mind, even in physical life. We're constantly creating our reality through consciousness, but the process is usually too slow and filtered to notice. Stage 3. The bardo of becoming occurs when consciousness begins preparing for its next incarnation. In this stage, awareness starts to condense back toward individual identity, drawn by karmic patterns and unresolved attachments toward a new physical birth. This isn't a passive process. Consciousness actively participates in choosing its next life circumstances, though usually unconsciously. The masters describe how awareness is drawn towards situations that match its karmic patterns, like iron filings attracted to a magnet. Time and space transformation occurs throughout all three stages. Linear time dissolves consciousness, can experience the past, present, and future simultaneously. Physical space becomes fluid awareness, can instantly travel anywhere, perceive multiple locations at once, and exist in dimensions that have no physical equivalent. This isn't disorientation, it's consciousness operating according to its natural laws rather than the constraints of physical matter. The masters learn to navigate these non-physical dimensions with the same skill that we navigate physical space. Karmic influence on experience shapes every aspect of the post-death journey. Consciousness doesn't encounter random experiences. Everything it perceives reflects its accumulated mental and emotional patterns. Positive karma manifests as beautiful, peaceful experiences, while negative karma creates challenging or frightening encounters. But here's the crucial insight. Even in the most challenging experiences, consciousness always has the opportunity to recognize the visions as projections of its own mind and return to the clear light of pure awareness. This recognition is the key to liberation at any stage of the post-death journey. Liberation opportunities exist throughout all three stages, but they require recognition of consciousness's true nature. At any moment, awareness can stop engaging with its projections and rest in its own luminous essence. This recognition leads to what the masters call liberation in the bardo, freedom from the cycle of death and rebirth. The subtle body that carries consciousness after death isn't a vague spiritual concept. It's a precisely mapped energy vehicle with specific capabilities and limitations. Understanding its nature reveals profound truths about consciousness itself and why awareness doesn't depend on physical matter. Composition and structure of the subtle body consists of what Tibetan masters call subtle matter, energy that's more refined than physical matter, but still substantial enough to carry identity, memory, and perceptual abilities. This isn't empty space, it's a structured field of consciousness that maintains coherent patterns while being infinitely more flexible than physical form. Modern physics is beginning to understand similar concepts through quantum field theory and studies of consciousness as a fundamental property of reality. The subtle body appears to operate according to quantum principles, where observation affects reality and consciousness plays an active role in determining experience. Instant travel capabilities allow the subtle body to move anywhere instantly through focused intention. Unlike physical travel, which requires moving through space over time, consciousness can simply shift its attention to any location and immediately be present there. This isn't teleportation, it's consciousness, recognizing that space and time are constructs that don't limit awareness itself. Near-death experiencers consistently report this ability, describing how they could instantly visit distant locations, observe events happening far away, or even travel to otherworldly realms simply by intending to be there. This matches exactly what Tibetan masters described as the natural mobility of consciousness freed from physical constraints. Enhanced perception abilities of the subtle body far exceed physical senses. Consciousness can perceive the thoughts and emotions of others directly, see through solid objects, observe events across vast distances, and even perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. This isn't supernatural, it's consciousness operating without the filtering limitations of physical sense organs. The masters describe this perception as more vivid and immediate than physical sensation because it's direct consciousness to consciousness contact rather than information filtered through dense matter. This explains why near-death experiencers often report that their out-of-body perceptions were more real and clear than ordinary waking consciousness. Interaction with the living occurs because consciousness can directly interface with other minds, regardless of whether they're embodied or not. The deceased can perceive the mental and emotional states of the living, respond to thoughts and prayers directed toward them, and even influence physical events through focused intention. This interaction isn't one way. The living can also perceive and communicate with consciousness operating in subtle bodies. though this usually requires some degree of psychic sensitivity or meditative development. Dreams, visions, and intuitive impressions are common ways this communication occurs. Memory and identity maintenance in the subtle body explains why the deceased often appear in dreams or visions with their familiar personality intact. The subtle body carries all the patterns that constituted their individual identity: memories, personality traits, emotional patterns, and habitual ways of thinking. However, these patterns gradually transform as consciousness moves through the post-death stages. Individual identity slowly dissolves as awareness expands beyond personal limitations toward universal consciousness. This isn't loss, it's the natural evolution of consciousness toward its unlimited nature. Creative power amplification occurs because consciousness in the subtle body can manifest thoughts and emotions directly as experiences. Without the dense matter of physical reality to slow down the manifestation process, mental patterns instantly become perceptual reality. This reveals something profound about consciousness. Even in physical life, we're constantly creating our reality through our mental and emotional patterns, but the process is usually too slow and filtered to notice. In the subtle body, this creative power becomes immediate and obvious. Limitations and constraints still exist because consciousness in the subtle body remains conditioned by its accumulated patterns. While awareness has tremendous freedom and power, it's still influenced by karmic imprints, emotional attachments, and habitual ways of perceiving reality. These limitations gradually dissolve as consciousness moves through the post-death stages, but initially, the subtle body operates within the same basic patterns that characterize the person's living consciousness. This is why spiritual development during life is so important. It determines the degree of freedom consciousness will have after death. One of the most profound aspects of the post-death journey is how individual identity gradually dissolves as consciousness expands toward its universal nature. This isn't destruction, it's the natural evolution of awareness returning to its unlimited essence. The gradual dissolution process occurs in predictable stages as consciousness moves through the post-death realms. Initially, personal identity remains intact. The deceased maintains their familiar sense of self, complete with memories, personality traits, and emotional patterns. But gradually, these individual characteristics begin to dissolve, like salt dissolving in water. This dissolution isn't random or chaotic. It follows the same pattern as the death process itself, with the most superficial aspects of identity dissolving first, followed by deeper layers of personality, and finally the core sense of individual selfhood merging back into universal consciousness. Memory transformation begins with recent memories becoming less vivid and important, while deeper, more significant memories initially become more prominent. The deceased often experience a life review where all their experiences are seen from a broader perspective, understanding the deeper meaning and connections between events that weren't apparent during life. As the dissolution process continues, even these significant memories begin to lose their personal charge. They're still present, but they're experienced more like watching a movie about someone else's life rather than reliving personal experiences. Eventually, individual memories merge into the vast ocean of universal memory. Personality pattern dissolution follows a similar trajectory. The habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and reacting that constituted the person's unique personality gradually become less rigid and defining. Negative patterns like anger, fear, or attachment naturally dissolve as consciousness expands beyond the limitations that created them. Positive qualities like love, compassion, and wisdom don't disappear. They expand beyond their personal limitations to become universal qualities. The love a person felt for their family becomes universal love. Their personal wisdom becomes cosmic understanding. The role of attachment in slowing or accelerating this dissolution process is crucial. Strong attachments to people, places, or experiences can keep consciousness bound to individual identity patterns, preventing the natural expansion toward universal awareness. This is why spiritual traditions emphasize the importance of letting go, not as rejection of life, but as preparation for consciousness's natural evolution. Conversely, consciousness that has learned to rest in its essential nature during life dissolves individual limitations more easily, experiencing the expansion as a return home rather than a loss of identity. Stages of identity expansion occur as consciousness recognizes itself in increasingly broader contexts. First, individual identity expands to include family and loved ones. The boundaries between self and others begin to dissolve. Then, awareness expands to include all beings, all life, and eventually all existence. This isn't a loss of self, it's the recognition that the individual self was always a temporary focusing of universal consciousness. Like a wave recognizing itself as ocean, individual awareness discovers its true nature as unlimited consciousness itself. The fear of ego death often arises during this process because the ego interprets dissolution as annihilation. But what's actually happening is the opposite. Consciousness is discovering its true, unlimited nature. The fear comes from identifying with the temporary patterns rather than the eternal awareness that observes all patterns. Masters who have prepared for this dissolution through spiritual practice experience it as liberation rather than loss. They've already learned to identify with awareness itself rather than its temporary contents, so the dissolution of individual patterns is welcomed as freedom. Universal mind recognition is the ultimate stage of this process, where individual consciousness recognizes itself as universal consciousness temporarily focused through a particular perspective. This isn't a merger with something external, it's the recognition that individual awareness was always universal awareness appearing to be separate. This recognition can occur at any stage of the post-death journey, and it's the goal of all Tibetan death practices. When consciousness recognizes its universal nature, it achieves what the masters call liberation, freedom from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Practical implications for the living emerge from understanding this dissolution process. If individual identity is temporary and consciousness is universal, then our true nature is far vaster than we typically imagine. This understanding can transform how we live, reducing ego-driven suffering and increasing our capacity for love, compassion, and wisdom. What's truly remarkable about these ancient consciousness maps is how precisely they align with cutting-edge discoveries in quantum physics, consciousness research, and near-death studies. The masters weren't creating religious mythology, they were documenting the actual mechanics of consciousness freed from physical constraints. Near-death research validation provides compelling evidence for the Tibetan descriptions of post-death consciousness. Dr. Raymond Moody's pioneering studies documented thousands of cases where clinically dead patients reported experiences that match exactly what Tibetan masters described: consciousness separating from the body, enhanced perception, encounters with beings of light, and life reviews. Dr. Pim van Lommel's rigorous medical studies of cardiac arrest patients revealed that consciousness continues during periods when brain activity is completely absent. Patients accurately described medical procedures, conversations, and events that occurred while they were clinically dead, impossible if consciousness were produced by the brain. These findings validate the Tibetan understanding that consciousness operates independently of physical brain activity and can perceive reality through non-physical means. Quantum consciousness theories emerging from physics align remarkably with ancient Tibetan insights. Quantum mechanics reveals that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining reality. The observer effect shows that awareness literally affects what becomes real at the quantum level. Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's theories of quantum consciousness suggest that awareness operates through quantum processes that aren't confined to the brain. Their research indicates that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe itself, exactly as Tibetan masters taught. Non-local consciousness research demonstrates that awareness can operate beyond the constraints of space and time. Studies of remote viewing, telepathy, and precognition show that consciousness can access information from distant locations and even future events capabilities that the Tibetan masters described as natural properties of the subtle body. Dr. Dean Radin's rigorous experiments at the Institute of Noetic Sciences have documented these non-local consciousness abilities under controlled laboratory conditions, providing scientific validation for what Tibetan masters observed through direct experience. Quantum field theory parallels reveal striking similarities between modern physics and ancient consciousness maps. Quantum fields are invisible energy structures that underlie all physical reality, remarkably similar to the Tibetan description of subtle matter that composes the post-death consciousness vehicle. The quantum understanding that information and energy can exist independently of physical matter aligns perfectly with the Tibetan teaching that consciousness continues after bodily death in a subtle energy form. Holographic universe theory suggests that all information in the universe is contained in every part, like a hologram where each fragment contains the whole image. This matches the Tibetan understanding that individual consciousness contains universal consciousness, that each person's awareness is a localized expression of cosmic mind. This theory explains how consciousness, after death, can access universal knowledge and experience. Expanded awareness that transcends individual limitations. Consciousness as fundamental reality is increasingly accepted by leading physicists and consciousness researchers. Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, stated that consciousness is fundamental and matter is derived from it, exactly the opposite of materialist assumptions. This scientific shift toward recognizing consciousness as primary reality validates the Tibetan understanding that awareness doesn't depend on physical matter, but is the fundamental fabric from which all experience emerges. Time and space relativity, discovered by Einstein, aligns with Tibetan descriptions of how consciousness operates after death. If time and space are relative constructs rather than absolute realities, then consciousness freed from physical constraints could indeed experience past, present, and future simultaneously, as the masters described. Morphic field research by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake suggests that information and patterns can be transmitted across space and time through non-physical fields. This provides a scientific framework for understanding how consciousness after death can access memories, communicate with the living, and influence physical reality. The hard problem of consciousness that stumps materialist science, explaining how subjective experience arises from objective matter, dissolves when we adopt the Tibetan perspective that consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. If awareness is primary, then the question isn't how matter creates consciousness, but how consciousness creates the appearance of matter. Implications for understanding reality extend far beyond death studies. If the Tibetan masters were correct about consciousness continuing after death, then our entire understanding of reality needs revision. We're not biological machines that accidentally developed awareness. We're consciousness itself, temporarily focused through physical forms. This understanding transforms not just how we approach death, but how we live. If consciousness is fundamental and continues beyond physical death, then developing awareness becomes the most important work we can do, both for this life and whatever lies beyond. The ancient Tibetan masters weren't creating religious fantasies, they were mapping the actual territory of consciousness freed from physical limitations. Their detailed observations of post-death awareness, validated by modern research, reveal that you are far more than your physical brain, and that consciousness continues its journey long after the heart stops beating. This knowledge transforms everything. Death isn't the end of awareness, but consciousness returning to its natural, unlimited state. The subtle body that carries your identity and memories through the post-death journey is real and operates according to discoverable laws. The gradual dissolution of individual identity into universal consciousness isn't loss, it's the ultimate homecoming. But most importantly, this understanding reveals your true nature right now. You're not a biological accident that accidentally developed consciousness. You're consciousness itself, temporarily focused through a physical form. Every moment of awareness, every experience of love, every insight into the nature of mind is preparing you for the greatest journey consciousness ever undertakes. The masters spent lifetimes developing the awareness that would serve them after death. You can begin that development right now, in this moment, by recognizing the luminous awareness that's reading these words. That awareness, spacious, knowing, and utterly present, is your true nature and your eternal companion. If this ancient wisdom has opened your eyes to the deeper nature of consciousness, there's so much more to explore. Click the video appearing on your screen right now to discover the secret Tibetan practice for maintaining consciousness through death, where I reveal the specific techniques masters use to remain aware throughout the entire death and rebirth process. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced consciousness operating beyond physical limitations? Your insights help build a community of people exploring the deepest mysteries of awareness itself. The ultimate question isn't whether consciousness survives death. The masters proved that centuries ago. The question is, how will you develop the awareness that is your true nature, both for this life and for the incredible journey that lies beyond?